I'm Hanem Abouelezz, and my title is a landscape ecologist. I have a wildlife ecology background, but I work on both wildlife-oriented and vegetation and habitat-oriented work here at the park. Recent research from other parts of the state showing declining calving rates in elk down in south central parts of the state, where there is very little motorized recreation, but lots of on-foot recreation and bicycle recreation. So I think classically, folks have always been concerned about motorized intrusion into wildlife habitat, but there is data to show that when enough non-motorized folks are accessing a place, especially during what we'd call sensitive times of the year, right? Mm-hmm. Spring is a sensitive time. You've got animals that are coming out of the winter. They may have depleted some of the winter forage that was available to them. Mm-hmm. And then they're also either in their third trimester of pregnancy, which is a very demanding time, right? That's when the calves are putting on most of the growth that they're going to do, and they're taking a lot of resources to do that. And then on top of that, then they've got to go through the birthing process, have the calf on the ground, and then survive through potentially spring snowstorms, pressure from predators, etc. It's like, well, you and another 100,000 people and another 100,000 people and 1 million people, right, could have bothered that animal, that single animal. So when we are engaging with wildlife in these high visitation areas, we really want to think about ourselves as part of the human system, not just your single experience with that animal, because it's the cumulative, where you can see things over time. And we don't have data or have not done projects on that here in Rocky, but there are instances where they've documented that you can see declining calf rates or calf survival can go down. That could cause that animal to not forage as much as it normally would. Maybe that's going to impact its milk production, so those babies don't make it through their first couple of months of life. Elk are going to start calving here pretty soon. You know, we're into May already. We're going to see quite a few elk calves on the ground by the end of the month. And you may have some residual calving into the beginning of June. We're going to see that with our moose as well. And so the females are going to act very differently now than they might have a couple of months ago. And their tolerance buffer is going to be very different, especially when those calves, newborn calves, hit the ground. When we're talking about wildlife viewing, is that they don't know that we delineated a specific distance that is okay and not okay, right? So you might say 120 feet from this cow moose, I'm fine. And I would ask you as a visitor or the viewer, is that animal responding to your presence? Because if they're doing anything different from what they were doing when you first started to approach them, you're interrupting their space. And in a park that gets over 4 million visitors a year, you know, that can be quite a few interruptions for an animal that's trying to reproduce and survive in a really challenging high elevation environment. You know, I think many of our visitors may only experience Rocky on a sunny day in July. And I try to remind folks, you know, that these animals are trying to survive year round, really harsh conditions. And sometimes, you know, they're on the edge of if they're going to make it from year to year. And so we don't want to disrupt them, especially in a sensitive time period. So from the sort of the ethical viewing standpoint, I think those are some things to think about. I can give you an example that happened to our staff. We're 100, 200 yards away from the elk. And a mother elk had just had a newborn calf. And she started to charge across the meadow from about 150 yards. It's true of all wildlife species and individuals within those species. We tend to think of them as homogeneous. You know, one cow elk is going to behave the same way that another cow elk is going to behave. And that is definitely not true. And so you want to be mindful of that. If that animal is responding to your presence, If they're picking their head up, they're looking at you for a long period of time. These are the subtle markers that you're disrupting them. And you'll hear some of the more advanced stages, right? The moose lays its ears back, the hackles on the back of the neck will rise, and those are good things to be aware of. And if that's happening, you're really way too close. I think the biggest thing that we see with a lot of our smaller critters is that they are getting fed, and we shouldn't be doing that. And so I think that is an appropriate message for any time of the year, because we don't want them, they don't seem as potentially threatening, right? As a big bull moose standing there where you might say, oh, wow, I should really give that his space. You got a little marmot and he's coming up to you and maybe looking for some attention, right? We lead the animals away and encourage them, not to be consuming human food. And we don't want to be in a situation where we build aggression into those animals because we're providing them food or providing them inappropriate attention, and then they could end up biting somebody. Another thing that I think of with both the ungulate species and the marmots and our smaller wildlife is, if they're coming to you, that doesn't mean that you should interact with them closely. It means you should get out of their way. Just because an animal is tolerant of your presence does not mean it is domesticated in any way. And I have seen this sort of mixing of those two concepts as well. The animal that we have here in the Estes Valley and in certain areas of Rocky Mountain National Park, they understand that a certain level of human presence around them is not going to impact them negatively, right? So, but just because they don't flee the way that you might see if you encountered a caribou in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge that had never seen a person, and they're going to flee at 400 yards. That doesn't mean that they're tame in any way, and it doesn't mean that they're really any less wild than any other wildlife species or elk that you might see in a less developed place. Wildlife are constantly operating in a space of cost benefit. So if you're trying to survive throughout the year, you do not want to expend energy when you don't have to. So they know very well that if I'm walking down the trail in Rocky and they happen to be adjacent to that trail or in the trail, I'm probably not going to bother them based on all of the previous experiences that they've had with humans in that same space. So, but that doesn't mean that they're tame or that we should approach them or that we should be trying to pet them, because as soon as they become truly uncomfortable or they feel or sense a threat, they may react very differently than how they've been reacting for the last 2 hours while you've been observing them. To maintain the wildness in these animals, we want them to eat their natural diets and be healthy. They don't do well when we supplement them with feed. That has been seen outside the park when folks have fed animals things like birdseed and other things. We've seen health problems and even mortality occur in elk. Mule deer in established numbers, that's the deer species that you typically expect to see at this elevation in the mountains in Colorado. And every once in a while, we will get a sighting of a white-tailed deer from time to time, but their habitat is much more so out at the lower elevations and on the prairie in Colorado. What you can do if you disrupt them too often is cause them to abandon their nests. You can cause nest failure, where the adults are too distracted to feed their young adequately over time. And so these things can definitely be a problem. black bears here in Rocky in fairly low densities. If you think about the park sort of carved into thirds on an elevational gradient, we've got a third of the park is alpine tundra, a third of the park is subalpine, so spruce and fir forest. Neither of those two ecotypes are bear habitat. So our bears are going to be concentrated at our lower elevations. And what else is concentrated at our lower elevations? Campgrounds, food, vehicle parking, food in vehicles. And so bears are extremely intelligent. They're gonna figure out how to get in your car if it's unlocked. They're gonna figure out how to get in your tent if it's got food in it. And once they receive a single food reward, they've learned something, right? They've learned something pretty important if you're a bear trying to survive in the wild. And so we don't want to reinforce that, and we don't want to even provide a single opportunity for that to occur. So really critical to secure your food at all times. If you've got it in a vehicle, cover it with a blanket. Use the bear lockers that are provided in the park as much as possible, because we want to keep our bears healthy. We want to keep them on the landscape. We don't want to be in a situation where we have to deal with a bear that has been habituated consistently to humans. And that can cause not only a threat to the humans, but also continue these issues of things like house break-ins, vehicle break-ins, etc. Popular bighorn sheep viewing area, of course, is Sheep Lakes in Horseshoe Park and on the east side of the park. And that's where people tend to encounter sheep a little bit more closely. And I think we need to be really mindful. Sheep are delicate animals, and I'm not sure if folks are as familiar with that. You know, they tend to be a little bit less robust than some of the other hoofed animals that you're going to encounter in the park. And we really want to make sure that our sheep populations are doing well. They've faced many different types of challenges, from competition with livestock to disease issues. And so we want to do a good job of taking care of our sheep, allowing them to get to water. And so that's a place there where sheep are often trying to cross the road and get to water. They're going to have their lambs with them, right? They're going to be small lambs this time of year. They're trying to avoid predators. They're trying to maintain access to their escape terrain. That's a key survival strategy for bighorn sheep. Sometimes sheep will sort of exhibit almost what you'd call like a panicking type of behavior. They'll start running around and swirling around, and they may be trying to go through the area that you're standing in, and they can't quite figure out how to do it safely, and they can get a little bit flustered. Thing about coyotes, on top of the classic give them their space message, is a lot of times if the pair has a den, they may trail people that are moving in that space. And so I've heard people say in sort of an upset way, I had coyotes, stalking me. And that's probably not true. It's most likely that you're near their den and they're trying to escort you out, and they'd like to see you leave.
Yes.
So that's something to be cognizant of coyotes, is that they may engage in that behavior and they're not being threatening, but it does mean you should probably move along, right? Because again, we can go from a non-threatening space to something that might be a little bit more of an encounter if we don't respond to the requests of these animals, because they're essentially trying to make that request and say, hey, you're in my space. I probably have young around. They wouldn't waste their energy following you for no reason. And another thing to be conscious of with dogs. So coyotes can react to dogs in their space. So you want to make sure that you're keeping dogs, number one, in areas where you're allowed to have dogs, and not bringing them onto trails where they're going to be deeper into the wilderness and deeper into the habitats of these animals. But we do have all of these animals very close in proximity to our parking lots as well. There'll be some coyote denning near Sheep Lakes. Is a great place to see them, and you can view them from the parking lot and get some great photographs with some of those fancy cameras.